In 1948, President Harry S. Truman made history by signing Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the U.S. military. At a time when racism was deeply rooted in American society, this bold move challenged the status quo. It was driven by the bravery of black veterans, growing civil rights pressure, and the global need for America to live up to its ideals. Truman's decision not only reshaped the military, it paved the way for the civil rights movement and proved that true leadership means doing what's right, no matter the cost. As the smoke cleared in 1945 and the Allied powers celebrated their victory over fascism, over 1 million African American soldiers returned home, not to a nation that honored them, but to a system that denied them basic human rights. These men had worn the uniform, fought in Europe and the Pacific, and bled for a flag that still waved over segregated schools, buses, bathrooms, and barracks. During World War II, black troops had been assigned to segregated units, often relegated to manual labor, supply runs, and support roles, even though many demonstrated immense courage and capability under fire. Units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion proved time and again that bravery, strategy, and honor were not defined by skin color. Still, they were excluded from white combat units, denied promotions, and subjected to constant humiliation within the military structure. Back home, the contradiction between America's fight for freedom and its practice of racial apartheid was glaring. U.S. propaganda abroad painted the country as a land of liberty, yet newspapers from New York to Chicago to Mississippi were filled with reports of lynchings, racial violence, and discrimination. For returning black veterans, the insult was even deeper. They had risked their lives for a country that would not let them vote, drink from the same fountain, or even enter certain stores. Among the most harrowing events was the brutal beating of Sergeant Isaac Woodard in 1946, a decorated African-American soldier who was attacked and blinded by a white police officer just hours after being honorably discharged. His only crime? Asking to use the bathroom at a bus stop in South Carolina. The news of Woodard's assault shocked the conscience of the nation and personally enraged President Harry Truman, who saw this as not just an act of racism, but a betrayal of American values. Truman, though a man raised in Missouri with the racial attitudes typical of his time, could not ignore the moral crisis unfolding in front of him. The letters poured into the White House. Civil rights leaders demanded justice. Black veterans marched in uniform, holding American flags, daring the country to live up to its ideals. It was here, in this atmosphere of anger, shame, and awakening, that the seeds of Executive Order 9981 were planted. The military, so long a symbol of order, hierarchy, and tradition, was about to become the first major American institution to face integration head-on. Harry S. Truman did not enter the presidency as a civil rights champion. A product of rural Missouri, he grew up with the normalized prejudices of his time. But the Oval Office has a way of confronting men with truths they can't ignore. And by 1948, Truman was no longer just a former senator from a segregated state. He was the leader of the free world, and the hypocrisy of American racism was knocking at his door. The moment that shook Truman into action came not just from reading cold policy reports or political memos. It came from a human story, brutal and raw. When the White House received details of Sergeant Isaac Woodard's blinding, the president was reportedly horrified. Woodard had served honorably in the Pacific, and within hours of returning to the United States, he was beaten by a local police chief until his eyes were destroyed. The case, widely covered and championed by civil rights groups, made it impossible for Truman to pretend that justice was being served in post-war America. He said plainly, in a private meeting with civil rights leaders, "My stomach turned when I learned of that. I knew I had to do something." And he did. In December 1946, Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights, the first serious federal initiative aimed at examining racism, segregation, and injustice in America. Its 1947 report, titled "To Secure These Rights," was a scathing indictment of segregation. It boldly recommended desegregating the armed forces, ending discrimination in federal employment, and enforcing voting rights nationwide. But for Truman, This was not just a policy debate. It was a personal and political moral reckoning. He told advisers that civil rights were now a moral priority for his presidency, regardless of the political fallout. And that fallout came swiftly. Southern Democrats, infuriated by Truman's shift, began to rebel. When he added civil rights to the Democratic platform in 1948, Southern delegates walked out of the party convention. They formed the Dixiecrat Party, nominating segregationist Strom Thurmond to challenge Truman in the presidential election. Truman's support for civil rights nearly split his party in half. Still, Truman stood firm. Despite intense political pressure, he declared, "My duty as president is to make sure that every American is treated equally. If the South doesn't like it, they can leave the party, but I won't stand for racism under the flag." That statement marked a turning point, not just for Truman, but for America. The man who once tolerated segregation was now risking his presidency to confront it. In the face of backlash from powerful Southern lawmakers, Truman prepared to take his boldest step yet, ending segregation in the military, where millions of young Americans had learned discipline, courage, and patriotism, but not equality. As the 1940s came to a close, America found itself not just at a crossroads at home, but under a global microscope. The Second World War had barely ended, and already a new kind of battle was brewing, the Cold War. But unlike the guns and bombs of WWII, this war was ideological. It was a war for hearts and minds across the world, and the United States wanted to be seen as the beacon of freedom, democracy, and justice. There was only one problem: segregation. America's racial caste system had become a major propaganda weapon for the Soviet Union, which constantly highlighted how the U.S., despite claiming to be the land of liberty, lynched its own citizens, suppressed black voters, and segregated its soldiers. How could America preach freedom to Europe, Asia, and Africa when its black citizens couldn't even share a barracks or battlefield equally with their white counterparts? This international embarrassment wasn't lost on the Truman administration. Civil rights were no longer just a domestic issue. They were now a strategic liability in the battle for global influence. Soviet newspapers published stories of black veterans being attacked, of schools kept separate and unequal, of Jim Crow laws that mocked the Constitution. Anti-American demonstrations erupted in newly decolonizing nations, where citizens saw America's racism as evidence that its promises of freedom were hollow. Truman understood that if the U.S. wanted to lead the free world, it had to clean its own house first. The military, symbol of national strength and pride, became the most logical and urgent place to begin. Desegregating it would not only serve justice, but also send a clear signal to the world. America was changing, but it was also a practical decision. Military commanders reported that segregation harmed morale, efficiency, and logistics. In combat zones, the racial divisions created confusion and resentment. In some theaters of war, black and white soldiers had already begun working side by side, not because of policy, but because the urgency of war had forced unity on the battlefield. The old excuses were collapsing. The armed forces had become the most visible failure of racial democracy, and Truman saw desegregation not just as an ethical choice, but a strategic necessity. And so, as civil rights leaders pushed harder and the eyes of the world remained fixed on America's contradictions, Truman prepared to make history with Executive Order 9981, an order that would change the military and America forever. On July 26, 1948, in a quiet but monumental moment in American history, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The document itself was just a few paragraphs long, typed in plain font on White House letterhead, but its words carried the weight of centuries and the promise of a new future. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. With the stroke of a pen, Truman became the first president to formally commit the federal government to civil rights reform. It wasn't a speech, a slogan, or a symbolic gesture. It was binding federal policy, and it directly challenged America's Oldest institution of racial segregation, the military. For many, this was unthinkable. The military had long been a bastion of hierarchy and tradition, where racial segregation was as routine as saluting the flag. The idea of black and white, soldiers living, training, and fighting together, as equals, sparked outrage, particularly among Southern officers and politicians. Critics warned that it would destroy discipline, undermine morale, and disrupt command. But Truman didn't flinch. He had already faced down the Dixiecrats, risked alienating powerful members of his own party, and heard every possible excuse. Yet he stood firm in his conviction that segregation had no place in a country that called itself free, and no place in a military that represented the United States to the world. The order didn't just demand change, it created a new institution to make it happen. The President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services, later known as the Fahey Committee, after its chairman Charles Dicey Fahey. This group was charged with overseeing implementation, monitoring progress, and ensuring that each branch of the armed forces took real, measurable steps toward integration. Of course, the executive order didn't transform the military. Overnight, resistance was fierce. Some commanders dragged their feet, some ignored the directive altogether, and others sought ways to delay or dilute its impact. It would take years of oversight, protest, and pressure before the military was truly integrated. But what mattered was that the foundation had been laid. The moral line had been drawn. Segregation in the armed forces was now officially, irrevocably, on the path to extinction. And for the first time in American history, a president had said clearly, "We will not tolerate racism under our flag." The signing of Executive Order 9981 was a bold beginning, but the real fight had just begun. In military bases across the South, resentment brewed. Some white officers viewed Truman's order as an insult to military tradition. Others saw it as a political stunt, not a directive to be followed. Racial prejudice ran deep, and in many quarters of the armed forces, integration was openly opposed, covertly sabotaged, or deliberately slowed. Southern senators and military officials lobbied behind closed doors, hoping to delay enforcement. Some warned of mass resignations. Others threatened political retribution. In certain commands, black soldiers continued to be segregated in housing and mess halls, despite the clear language of the order. The newly formed Fahey Committee faced an uphill task. Its members traveled from base to base, interviewing soldiers, inspecting facilities, and documenting violations. They issued reports exposing the ways the military was clinging to outdated policies, shielding racist practices behind bureaucratic procedures. Yet even amid resistance, change had momentum. In some units, particularly during the Korean War, integration began to occur out of necessity. Under fire, the color of a soldier's skin mattered less than their courage, their skill, and their commitment to the mission. Commanders in combat zones soon discovered what civil rights advocates had long insisted. Diversity did not weaken a unit, it made it stronger. Slowly, reality began to shift. The Navy and Air Force, under less institutional pressure than the Army and Marines, moved faster toward compliance. Young officers, some of whom had fought side by side with black troops in WWII, embraced the change. For many enlisted men, desegregation was not only welcome, but overdue. Meanwhile, civil rights leaders continued to monitor progress closely. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP's chief legal counsel, pushed for full accountability. Black newspapers published testimonies from soldiers experiencing progress, and from those still facing humiliation and exclusion. But every step forward came at a price. Black servicemen who challenged discriminatory practices risked disciplinary action, isolation, and even violence. Some paid with their careers, others with their lives. The integration of the military, though sanctioned from the top, had to be fought for from the bottom up, one base, one unit, one barracks at a time. Yet, the tide was turning, and Truman, despite the backlash, never reversed course. By 1950, just 2 years after Executive Order 9981, the United States found itself in another war, this time on the cold, mountainous battlefields of Korea. And although the military had not fully integrated by this point, The realities of combat would accelerate what politics and bureaucracy had delayed. The Korean War became a crucial proving ground for integration. Faced with mounting casualties, logistical chaos, and desperate need for manpower, military commanders could no longer afford to maintain strict racial divisions. In many cases, black soldiers were sent to reinforce depleted white units, not as an experiment in equality, but out of necessity. And then something extraordinary happened. It worked. Black and white soldiers fought side by side, not because Washington had forced them to, but because the battlefield demanded it. The myth that integrated units would break down under pressure was shattered by courage, loyalty, and shared sacrifice. Men who might never have spoken to each other in civilian life now depended on one another for survival. Bullets did not discriminate, and neither did the bond forged in war. General Matthew Ridgway, who replaced Douglas MacArthur as commander of U.S. forces in Korea, publicly praised integrated units, stating that they enhanced combat effectiveness. His endorsement provided critical support to the WWII Committee and the broader desegregation effort. The military brass could no longer deny what was happening in real time. Integration strengthened, not weakened, the U.S. military. Meanwhile, stories of heroism began to emerge. Black soldiers distinguished themselves in combat with bravery equal to any of their peers, often more so because they were also fighting the burden of proving their worth. Some received medals and commendations, though many acts of valor would go unrecognized for decades due to lingering racial bias. At the same time, black troops were writing letters home, describing how much had changed and how much hadn't. Segregated facilities still existed in some rear bases. Racism still showed its face in promotions, in assignments, in the words of superiors, but something was undeniably shifting. The military was becoming, slowly but surely, the first major institution in American life to attempt real racial integration, and it was happening not in the halls of Congress, but in the trenches of Korea. What began as Truman's moral gamble had become an unstoppable force. On the battlefield, equality was no longer just policy, it was survival. And with each passing month, the idea of a segregated military seemed more outdated, more offensive, and more incompatible with the country's identity. The Korean War didn't just test the military, it pushed it forward, forcing the United States to live up to the promise Truman had made in 1948. Absolutely. Here is the final expanded part, Part 7, of Why Harry Truman Ended Segregation in the U.S. Military in 1948, concluding the journey with emotional and historical closure. By the mid-1950s, the transformation that began with Executive Order 9981 was largely complete. For the first time in American history, the U.S. Armed Forces stood as a racially integrated institution, a model of what the nation itself had yet to become. It hadn't been easy. The change was fought for on paper, in courtrooms, in committee rooms, in barracks, and on battlefields. But in the end, the walls of segregation within the military cracked, crumbled, and fell. Not just because of orders from Washington, but because soldiers of all colors proved, over and over again, that courage has no race. And the credit for this pivotal turning point begins with one man, President Harry S. Truman. When Truman left office in 1953, his approval ratings were low. Many in the South saw him as a traitor to tradition. Even some within his own party questioned why he would risk so much political capital for an issue so divisive. But Truman never flinched. He would later say, "I had no idea it would cause such a fuss. I just knew it was right." His decision was a moral stand, not a political calculation, and history has judged it as one of the most courageous acts of his presidency. It set the precedent for future civil rights victories. The Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Moreover, the integration of the military changed lives beyond the battlefield. Generations of black soldiers and officers would now have access to careers, education, and respect that had long been denied to them. The military would go on to become one of the most diverse and inclusive institutions in American society, in no small part because of Truman's defiant leadership. In a country still struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities, Truman's executive order served as a reminder that leadership means doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular. Today, every soldier who serves, regardless of race, religion, or background, walks in the footsteps of that historic moment in 1948, when a president decided that under the American flag, there would be no second-class citizens. Harry Truman's decision to desegregate the U.S. military wasn't just about the military. It was about America's soul. He knew that the true strength of a nation isn't just measured by the power of its weapons, but by the fairness of its institutions and the dignity with which it treats all its citizens.